Hello, my name is Matthew, and it is Wednesday, April 29th. Here in Toronto, it's about 10 degrees. It's overcast, a little bit rainy, but we have a little heater going in our greenhouse, so that's a really happy thing. I hope you're safe. I hope everyone you love is well and doing the best you can in the midst of this shutdown. I want to speak a little bit about this webinar series that's starting this Friday, May 1st. That's in 2 days. It's called Cult Dynamics in Yoga and Buddhism, Recognition, Recovery, and Resilience. It runs 8 consecutive Fridays at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. So that would be a quiet early afternoon on the West Coast, a cozy evening in Europe, and a sunny Saturday down under. I'm making it sound like the course material will be pleasant as well, but not all of it will be. It's a 16-hour course. The resources are excellent. There will be just time for discussion, both in the Q&A segment of the presentations, but also via Google Classroom. The course fee is set at $150 Canadian for the 16 hours of instruction, but it's also COVID-19 negotiable. And all you have to do if you can't afford that is email me and we can work something out that works. I'm at threadsofyoga@gmail.com. You can find the registration link in the video notes here. Now, I launched this course. Well, I created the course, I would say, over the last 5 years of research. But I launched it back at the beginning of March before everything changed. Now, everything has changed, and that means that this course has to pivot and be responsive to changing circumstance. So I want to talk about 3 things that I will incorporate into the published or advertised course material, 3 lenses of relevance, we might say. Okay, given the fact that the pandemic has struck the world and so many people are in very stressed positions. Okay, so first lens, situational vulnerability. This is a term that people who study recruitment into cults use to describe, the point at which somebody becomes liable for recruitment. Now, situational vulnerability would be any temporary circumstance that destabilizes a person and makes them vulnerable to a group that promises the moon, that promises, a total solution, an overarching ideology, a safe haven, a loving community. Now, the pandemic is creating situational vulnerability on a mass scale. COVID-19 puts the majority of the planet's population in instability and uncertainty. So the prediction from cultic research would be that this would be a boom time for abusive organizations, which prey upon the vulnerability of people by offering, everything that I listed, usually through charismatic leadership. Now, as we know, the present harm of the shutdown is not evenly distributed. Some people are suffering far more egregiously than others, and the impacts of the shutdown have nothing to do with their attitudes, their personal psychology, their family constellations, or anything like that. Now, this fact mirrors the context in which cult recruitment happens as well. In times of stress, not everyone will be drawn into a given cultic organization. And those who are drawn in are not drawn in because of character flaws or their personal psychology. People are drawn into toxic groups because the groups capitalize on stress and the groups target certain people for deception. So situational vulnerability is something that I think is resonant for everybody and will be studied in detail in this course. Now, number 2, in my opinion, COVID-19 is an acute event that allows us to assess our capacity for critical thinking, collective care. It allows us to examine the nature of authority and to see clearly the difference between competent service and charismatic control. Now, with regard to this last point, consider what we see in the spectacle of Dr. Fauci sharing a stage with Trump. Now, the cult leader may be competent at manipulation and abuse, but his authority is self-generated and it's magnified by charisma. Now, when that mechanism is fully mobilized, not only does the leader not need to speak truthfully or act with empathy, he can actually make a virtue out of lies and cruelty. He can and will exploit his followers for as long as it works. It's kind of extraordinary that Fauci has been allowed to stand there beside him for so long, demonstrating what authority conferred by consensus reality and peer networks actually looks like. And what's the key to that competence and service? Fauci allows in outside information, which is exactly what the cult leader cannot do. Now, extrapolate that to the difference between the yoga or Buddhism cult leader who has no scope of practice, who makes unsupported health or spiritual claims, and whose only authority is his or her own allure. Contrast that with the yoga teacher who's actually dedicated to serving others and sharing power. Okay, so third, COVID-19 is microcosmic to climate collapse. It reveals in human systems what is progressing in all biosystems. The answer in both the microcosm and the macrocosm, in my opinion, is the same. We have to learn how not to dominate each other. We have to learn how to recognize institutional abuse, especially when it infiltrates altruistic movements. So in this course, I'll be pointing out that even eco-justice groups are not immune from cultic dynamics. So I've spent more than 15 years now recovering from my own cult experiences, and 5 years in almost full-time research of cult dynamics in the yoga and Buddhism worlds. And these worlds are embedded within global economics, which means that they're changing as fast as everything else is right now. So this means that this course has to be flexible and responsive to the shifting landscape week by week. But I would argue that the basic architecture of the course is still instructive for what we're up against going forward. With the modern globalized yoga and Buddhism worlds, we have about 50 years of cultic dynamics as the organizational norm. Now, my belief is that if we really look clearly at that history and its patterns, we'll be a lot better informed as we seek to create healthy work, activist, and spiritual communities going forward. So 8 webinars, discussion, Q&A during live broadcast and via Google Classroom. The full description of the course is in the link and on the registration page. So now I'll just finish up by quickly running through the 8 topics. On May 1st, the topic of the webinar, or the title of the webinar, is The Cultic Landscape, Its Patterns and Prism. And here we'll sketch out the basic facts of institutional abuse in yoga and Buddhism over the past 50 years or so. This is not in the abstract. I'm going to name names. And the analysis and the answers up front will be outlined in a presentation of something that I call the PRISM model, which I wrote about in my book called Practice and All is Coming. And the PRISM model is an acronym for pause, research, investigate, show, and model. And those would all be calls to action for specific steps that we can take to make sure that we are looking clearly at the history of institutional abuse in wellness communities. On May 8th, we'll look at cult definitions and specific readings. And this, I think, is really necessary because the word cult is a highly charged, shameful, messy, accusatory, sensationalistic pop culture term, and just people use it in really sloppy ways. But it means something really specific in the literature. And so we'll survey those definitions, which are really illuminating. And they also, I hope, destigmatize the entire vibe of what it means to be caught up in a cult. Um, okay, so third class, May 15th, is social control mechanisms in yoga and Buddhism. Now, can doing a lot of yoga wind up derailing your bodily autonomy? Can meditation or chanting erode your capacity for critical thinking? Yes, and yes. Let's take another example. Can putting in countless hours on your eco-justice campaign alienate you from your support structures and make you vulnerable to exploitation? One of the saddest facts of the cultic scene is that the very practices that the group offers for self-empowerment or for altruistic action can be weaponized against its members. Now, in yoga and Buddhism, we have to examine the outcomes of peak experiences or trance states, because often these are used not to help enrich members, or if they enrich members at first, they eventually are used to increase members' compliance. Now, in eco-activism, we have to examine the outcomes of intense group bonding experiences that occur during the stress of protest and incarceration. All right, so class number 4, May 22nd, we'll look at cults and attachment theory, going on the work of Alexandra Stein, which has been so helpful in my own life. Now, you can read more about why Stein's innovative studies are so healing on my website and in the course description, but for now, I'll leave it at this. Understanding the feelings and sensations of disorganized attachment is, in my opinion, a powerful key to protecting yourself from the trauma bond at the heart of the cult paradox, which is something that's very hard to explain, very shameful for most members and ex-members to contemplate. The question, why were you caught up in the trap of running towards somebody repeatedly, compulsively, when that person was terrifying and harmful? Disorganized attachment gives a really solid and empathetic answer for that. The next week, we look at leaders, enablers, bystanders, and beneficiaries. Now, people love to speculate about cult leaders, but it's really not that useful. We'll do a little bit of a review of some basic ideas that have come to us from psychoanalysis or from religious studies. But, in the end, what we can really know is that whoever the leader is, they're never acting alone. They're always shielded by what Peggy Cunningham calls a network of complicity, made up of those who enable, those who stand by. Anybody who facilitates or lets abuse happen does so because they benefit from it in some way. Leaders in yoga and Buddhism groups function in just this way. We can consider how somebody like Chogyam Trungpa, who founded what is now known as Shambhala International, never actually wrote, start to finish, any of the dozens of books that carry his name as author and that have served as propaganda for the group. His devotees did all of that. And consider, how could Harvey Weinstein have gotten away with serial assault with decades without his handlers facilitating that? Or Larry Nassar. Now, when we spend too much time speculating on the inner lives and motivations of monsters, we really miss the machines that let them wreak havoc. I think this is number 6, June 5th. The topic is called Close to Home, Cult Dynamics at the Local Level. And, something interesting about working as a journalist covering this material is that some of the worst stories I hear don't come from large and famous groups, but from actually neighborhood yoga studios and meditation centers. Now, cult recovery therapist Rachel Bernstein suggests, when she talks about the cult of two, as she describes abusive intimate relationships, she suggests that cultic dynamics can scale up and they can scale down. And in this webinar, I'll be exploring that murky threshold between a toxic work or community environment and abuse that becomes more highly organized. Second last, so this is number 7, June 12th, best practices for personal and group hygiene. In my book, Practice and All is Coming, where is it? Oh, it's right here. Hello. In the 6th section, I came up with 8 best practices, including assessing the situational vulnerability that I spoke about off the top, but also things like understanding the jargon of an abusive group, assessing the honesty of the group or its leader, figuring out what the sensations, the bodily sensations are of idealization, transference, and disorganized attachment. Also, things like figuring out what kinds of attitudes bystanders justify bystanding with. One of them has been coined by a reader of mine, actually. His name is Joseph Teskey, and he calls it "I got mineism," which is a way for the group member who doesn't feel that they've been harmed personally by an abusive organization to kind of ignore the harm that is being reported on that actually directly implicates them because they've been supporting the group. So 8 best practices. This is a real toolbox webinar that will introduce some real world skills. And then finally, on June 19th, we'll cover reporting, accountability, and policy. What does reporting on cults as an ex-member and a whistleblower accomplish? What does it feel like? What are the steps? How do you do it? How do you do it safely? What does it take to listen to and help platform a survivor's voice without re-traumatizing them? What can former group members do to exact justice and prevent abuse from continuing? We'll spend some time looking at some amazing grassroots support initiatives that are really promising, like the Satya Project, where former Shivananda Yoga members have organized their own independent investigation. And their first report, by the way, is due out at the end of May, so that will be available for our study during this course. Okay, so that's the course outline. I really hope that you can join us. Remember that there should be no money barrier whatsoever to you accessing this information. I do need to get paid in some way, so there is a course fee, but I fully invite anybody and everybody to email and to negotiate whatever is doable for them. And all you have to do is email me at threadsofyoga@gmail.com. So keep safe, and thank you so much.